Group program is part of a series, as you've heard, of events going on in March and April, part of the symposium on the Pagami Creek Fire 10-year anniversary. And this is one of 2 Tuesday group sessions. And I am so grateful to Aaron Kanya for the coordinating and moving Tuesday group in, and so grateful to Tom Roach and Carl Skustad, who will be speaking with us today. So they're both representatives of the U.S. Forest Service. They'll be giving us an overview of the Pagami Creek Fire. And Tom is the assistant fire manager for the West Zone. And Carl is the Kawishiwi District Recreation and Wilderness Lead. So thank you so much for being here today. Come on up.
We're going to do our best job at co-presenting here, so we'll be passing the microphone back and forth a few times as slides are relevant to whoever's particular experience is being reflected in them. Yeah, I'm Tom Roach, I'm Assistant Fire Management Officer at Cook, based in Cook. Okay, too quiet, thanks. So I work in, I'm based in Cook, but I help cover fire prevention and fuels management program for the West Island Spirit, which would be basically Aurora, even in Cook, that triangle of ground.
Sure. Good morning. My name is Carl Skustad. I'm the Kawishiwi Ranger District Assistant Ranger here for Wilderness and Recreation. I've met most of you over the last 12 years. I guess I've been 11 years because I got here the first year of Pagami. Started like 6 months after I took the job. So Tom and I have been working together since then. I first met Tom in Montana when he was Division Soup on one of my crews that came over the hill, and he was from Minnesota, and eventually I got back here to Minnesota to meet up with Tom and work together a little bit closer. So like Tom says, we were both on the Pagami Creek Fire for many days. Quick, raise your hand if you were in Ely or the surrounding area in 2011. Okay, so quite a few of us, right? Who was actually in the smoke of Pagami Creek Fire? Pretty amazing, wasn't it? We actually we were 10 miles from the start of Pagami Creek Fire in Ely. We never got smoke in Ely. Okay. Who was in smoke downstream, right? All the way to Duluth, Becky, Chicago, Milwaukee.
I was in Milwaukee.
I went to school in Wisconsin, and my friends in Milwaukee called me like, "What are you doing up there?" Plenty. We were on it for about 70 days. Okay, so we'll go over just a summation of those 70 days, and find us afterward if we don't get to your questions during the next few minutes.
All right, any questions up to this point? We can start into the slides, and we'll just start ripping through them and talk about what we're seeing in those slides and the experiences we had. And I guess I would just encourage people to raise their hand along the way, so you don't forget the question you had. That was 9 slides ago. If you have one, just pop it up there and we'll address it. Okay, so the Pagami Creek Fire started, I forget the exact date, but it was early August, and there was a lightning strike in the wilderness off of Pagami Creek, which is that's east of Lake One, and it was put in monitor status initially because it started in a lowland black spruce piece of ground, and so it was pretty inaccessible at that point, and we were watching it from the air for a few weeks, and actually for probably a week prior to it having its first real substantial growth, it had not shown any smoke week and a half, and we've been flying it regularly. And then one day the humidities got down and the winds picked up, and it did what our fires typically do in this country, is it just blew a big cigar-shaped fire off into kind of a nice big chunk of no man's land that was very hard to reach. So that's the history of it. That was on August 27th. And I remember that because it was my wife's birthday, and we were just about to go do some fun stuff for her birthday, and then I got a phone call and said, "Well, I have to leave right now." I went to Ely, and I came back about 2.5 weeks later. We can start the slides, I think. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm holding a clicker. Okay. So this is the initial size up. This is after it had gone to that 300-acre cigar push. It started on the north side of the Pagami Creek, which is, that's me right there. Weird, okay. And so it's the start was on that side, and it blew across, and most of the fire, 95% of that 300 acres was on the south side of Pagami Creek. So you can see there's some blackened timber there. It burnt pretty hot when it did take off, and this is just me pulling up with my canoe paddle partner, Melissa Mako, and doing an initial size up, calling it into dispatch, telling them what we're seeing. This is just an example of how dry the fuels were. Everything was pretty available for consumption at this point. We weren't in what we were considering drought, but in August, the fuels do tend to get pretty dry around here most years. And so it was burning what we would call the 10 and the 100-hour fuels. And those are a reflection of how many hours it takes them to dry from, say, being rained on to being dried all the way through. So a 10-hour fuel is like the size of your finger, and that's going to dry out in about 10 hours of direct sunshine. So the 10-hour fuels and the 100-hour fuels, that's like a baseball bat, this kind of size thing, a 35-inch range. Those were consuming decently when we first pulled up to the fire. And then we were having some, sorry if I'm blocking your view. We were having some intermittent torching, and we immediately got some aircraft in there and subdued that current activity. This is some scorched timber on the north side before it even hopped across. It was about 3 acres on the north side of Pagami Creek. And within those 3 acres, it burned pretty vigorously before it jumped across the river. Here's our crews coming in. Actually, if you know which way the water flows in Pagami Creek, you could correct me and say this is actually them going out on one of their shifts, but it's an example of them traveling to and from the fire. So they had to go over beaver dams and a lot of gear and stuff to haul in those canoes, a lot more than even you can see in these guys' loads right here. They took a lot of stuff in which they left, so coming out there a little bit heftier, but a lot of hose, fuel, pumps, etc. Carl, you're a helicopter guy. You want to talk about what's going on here? You're actually the one.
Yeah, I came in this ship. This is our local resource. And our helitack crew out of Ely. So I actually came in as the resource advisor. So I was just going to back up a step and tell you what Tom and I's roles were on the fire. We wore many hats because it's our local unit. So that happens most often. We wear a lot of hats when we know the lay of the land. I was a helicopter manager this day, but also the resource advisor and an extension of the district ranger that day, approving this helispot. So normally we do not put helispots in wilderness, but as the resource advisor and the wilderness manager, this was deemed okay. And part of this and essential to the safety of the mission. It's pretty far back in there at this point.
I could add one thing. The reason we have, and thanks for clarifying our roles, I was an incident commander type 3, which means this fire's going to an extended attack phase where it's going to be burning for a little while. We go up in complexity levels, the bigger, the more people are on fire. I was the type 3 incident commander of this fire. So that was my role for the first couple of days until a larger team got there and took it over. It became a type 2 incident, I think on the 3rd day. But the reason we had these telespots in there is because we had to have a way to extract our personnel. If they had a chainsaw cut that maybe cut an artery, or a tree lands on them, which certainly is an everyday omnipresent hazard for our people, or any other number of things that can happen while you're in the woods fighting fire. So we do request these in these remote locations just to get our personnel out, and also it's a lot more efficient way to get gear in and out in a timely manner as well. This is the first hand crew that was in there. This was the Chippewa National Forest crew that came over, and they were here. They are cutting hemlock, so you can see how thick the fuels are. I mean, you can barely walk through the woods around here in places, not to mention travel safely through it. With the fire behind you, so we have to cut paths around them, and then we make a fuel break on the edges of the fire to help contain it. And then we usually surround those edges with a hose line. Okay, so now at this point in time, this is probably about the 3rd day. The forest very quickly determined that the situation we were going to have, because of this big cigar shaped fire that was out in the middle of no safety zones for us. We have to have a place where we can go to that's close to our fire, where our people can go be safe in a very short period of time if activity does pick up unexpectedly. There was no safety zones. There was a billion burning snags and dead trees around this 300 acres. Any one of them could have taken out one of our firefighters. And there's also not a lot of good water sources. So we did have some options to go to natural boundaries, and that was the plan initially, determined pretty quickly by the forest management, fire management program. So in order to take 2 teams, which would be the second team that came in and managed Greenwood this summer. And so I transitioned over to a new role at this point on about day 3 as a division supervisor, which means I'm in charge of the activities and the personnel on a chunk of ground. So this is myself and the adjoining division supervisor discussing tactics and what we're going to do, how we're going to try and corral this thing.
Sure. We also on this forest use public safety crews. So some of you may recognize Nancy and John working there with Roach to get the assignment to clear public. So public safety is we're sweeping the public out in front of a fire or adjacent to a fire. We'll go on to explain how we've changed that in the future and now versus then, but that's what we're getting started right here. We use our local resources for this because we know the lay of the land the best and the portages and the lakes and where all the campsites are. Okay, I slipped a couple slides in here on Tom. The beauty of Google Slides. Who recognizes this area of our Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness? North of there. Yes, Elton got it. So this, and the best way to, I always call that Heart Pond Lake. How many times have you gone across that, right? And you're like, I wish you could just go from 1 to 2, but you get to put your stuff back in your canoe and then you get to take it back out again, and you get to go back. So this was a holding line, correct me if I'm wrong. Yep, so we put irrigation through here and there with pumps on both sides. Next. That's what they look like.
So these are, I don't know if it's not the greatest picture, but this is basically just like a rainbird sprinkler head. And we put them up all along the portage, both stretches of portage on each side of Heart Lake. And so we had that portage, which in itself is not going to hold fire on its own. So what we did is we basically made a big wet line with sprinklers in a row that just put a chunk of rainforest in between what we were going to burn on the fire side and what we didn't want to burn, which was the portage and everything on the other side of it. So yeah, those were put up right away as one of our initial actions.
That was just an example of how much stuff we do carry, and I just threw this one in there to indicate there's a lot that goes into the process, right? So if a firefighter gets injured, they've got to get out. So that might be an example of a medic crew that's going in to be staged if needed.
So do you just put a pump in the lake and get brought with you?
Yes, so yeah, we do. So there's a pump that goes into the edge of the lake. You put it up far enough from the lake. You put a retainment system, like a little mini dike around it to hold it up on land, and then away it goes. And yeah, so we did have public going through that portage as we were prepping it. That's why I threw this slide in. Like, we don't take it lightly if we do end up having to close an area to our public. We try, in this case, for example, we're escorting the public, right, through an area so that they can go into another safer area and then let us do our work over in this polygon. We can't always do that.
Yeah, that was a very rare circumstance where we felt comfortable doing that, and partly, you know, there's a lot of interest. This was Labor Day weekend, and so a lot of people had plans to go into Lake 1 and 2 and beyond, and so we were trying to manage that, continue that situation without having to close down a huge chunk of wilderness. And as Carl said, we did learn some lessons from that experience, control dress. Additional holding crews in briefing for the fire operation. And so this was a crew from Missouri. We get people come from all over the country. There's not enough Minnesotans to, just go staff the Greenland fire or every other fire that takes off in the state after that would just have nobody to go put it out. So we share resources all across the country and we all travel frequently with fire assignments. So these guys are up from Missouri and they're getting in briefed here.
Put that one in for you, Tom.
Oh, okay, yeah, great.
Actually, share with them
Sure.
what this is and how it played into your levels of fuel.
Yeah, those are what Carl's got here. These are fuel sticks, we call them. And that's to represent the 1 hour fuel. And so those are going to dry out. Basically, they're going to reflect your relative humidity. Is what we're looking for there. And then we've got some other equipment we use here is a sling cyclometer. We can get humidity with that. This is going to tell you the 1 hour fuels, I should say, not the humidity. And then, we've got a number of things that measure winds and whatnot. So we are monitoring the weather very closely. Anytime we're on a fire, regardless of what our planned activities are, just for the sake of the firefighters and to forecast what's going to happen tomorrow and in future days. We often also will hire an incident meteorologist, which is a meteorologist that's trained in fire, wildland fire as well. And they'll come in and provide us very specific, site-specific weather forecasts, yeah.
And then I was gonna ask, do you have like a meteorological background? Is that
Nope.
part of your education?
No, we do learn a lot about fire or about weather and how it relates to fire as practitioners of fire. But if we really want to get specialty knowledge, we go to the National Weather Service typically. That's where we get our incident meteorologists from. So this is aerial ignition, and that's a helicopter, probably the one that we would staff out at the airport all summer long. And if it's not that one, we order in what we need. But we put an ignition device underneath that. That's got a barrel that drips burning fuel essentially, and it drips onto the forest. It's got a diesel mixture to it, so it burns longer than just like gas. Something a little flashy, go all for it's the ground. This stuff lands and continues to burn just long enough to where the vegetation will continue the fire on its own. So we're starting the aerial ignition here, and what we were doing, we would go to the downwind side of the fire, and we would light the forecasted downwind side so that the fire is going to run into our black. And then we go around the perimeters of the sides and finally up the upwind side. And so this large box that we were taking it to took the fire from 3,000 acres to about, I want to say 2 to 4. I'd have to look. I apologize not having that fresh on top of my head, but somewhere around $2,000 in acreage to take it to Pagami Creek, and then 1 and 2. And then those are very defined boundaries we had. We had a less defined boundary to the south going towards like Rock of Ages Lake, and then to the southeast. And our concerns were not as great there because the fire is going to be moving into the wilderness. Our primary objective here is to keep the fire from getting out of the wilderness, burning north up towards the Fernberg corridor, and the resorts up north of there. We needed to nurse that thing at least into around the bottom side of Lake 2 was going to be our goal. So if it did continue to burn south, it wasn't going to hook back around at that point to the Fernberg. So that was the intent of the firing operation. And all the perimeters did hold except for the perimeter that didn't hold. Talk about it in a few more slides. And we knew that perimeter was not going to hold fire. We figured it was going to go off into the wilderness. What we didn't anticipate was the extreme wind that we got about 5 days later, just as the fire was getting its most active. So here's some hand ignition, just cleaning up along the shorelines. Crews have little drip torches they go clean pockets up with. This is a crew from Michigan. They're called a fire use team. Fire use module, thank you. They're like an 8 to 10 person firefighting team that goes around and manages fires, specifically in wilderness areas and in fires where we are trying to oftentimes do burning operations like this. They're really specialists at that. So they were doing a lot of the cleanup ignition at this point, just kind of bopping around, seeing where we had thin areas and trying to thicken them up. And this is the fire I say cleaning up. It's burning unburned pockets, and it's like a big picture. We start coloring like around the edges, get those nice and secure, go back to your coloring days. And then we move interior, and people like this, there's a whole bunch of white in between all your squiggles. We want to clean all that up as much as possible. So we don't leave pockets that are going to flare out and get out from us. So we try to continue to clean those up and make it as complete as possible. This is peak fire. This is about 4 days into, I think the ignition operation was 3 days in the helicopter all total. And then a few more days with some hand ignition cleanup. This is probably about 5 days into the ignition operation. Up at Lake 2, we started getting peat fire, and that's a real sign of deep burning. And we got on that and put that out because peat is some pretty toxic, acrid smoke. We put sprinkler systems on that. And Carl, you got 20 years of that.
Yeah, so you've probably seen briefings on the news or attended them yourselves, and this is us. I mean, we still use a real map in many cases, and we brief on what we have and what we have to do left. This is Rock of Ages. This was actually the plan. This is what we want, where we wanted to hang it up. This is Weasel PMA, I believe, right in here. There's actually no established portage in here in the PMA. You can bushwhack through there. That's where we had it intended to hang up. We knew that there was a pretty good chance that it would pooch through here, but this is wilderness and that's okay. Fire can keep doing its thing in here. But it did, and then the wind got a hold of it. Go ahead, Tom. Right there does that make sense, Tom? That's where the fire went or pooched out? Yeah.
That's probably.
Yeah, okay, so maybe I can share a little bit about what's going through our head here as the public and campers. And was anybody camping out in front of this fire? Okay, there were people, right? Many of us know that, and we were out in front of this with our public safety crews and moving people out of the way. We closed a few lakes at a time. Usually that's going to be enough. We learned in this fire that many times it's not enough. Okay, so when you saw what we chose to do this past summer and close larger areas of the wilderness, that's a direct result of what we learned on this fire. We learned on this fire that it takes a long time to get that many people out of the wilderness safely. And they don't just scooch out real quick. Like even with the closures this summer, I flew the closure area, I want to say 5 days after we closed one area of the wilderness down by Island Creek, and found the last individual canoer, and they had no clue that the area was closed for the last 5 days. They're like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, I'm asking you to leave so that we could, because there's fires coming. So that's a little background on the public safety. There's a lot more to it. I'd be happy to talk with anyone more about that. But when this scooched out here, then we quickly closed Lake 2, 3, 4. Okay, that was what we thought was needed at the time. Then a couple days later, we had to close more, and a couple days later, we had to actually close more. So that's how it progressed. Let's see what's next on there. It continues to get a little darker.
This is just like probably on about the 9th now. I think the fire blew out on the 12th. So,
Correct.
yep. So and when I say blow out, that's when it really, like, it had a 2-day run that was quite significant. That started on the, I think, the 11th and 12th. 12th is a big day. So this is about the 9th it's like the last evening before I left. And the only reason I left is because I had done 14 days and I had done 15 days. We have 14-day assignments we typically send people home for to manage their safety. So as I left, the fire was getting quite active, and then I was at home, actually on the days it blew up. And this is down toward Rock Island. And yeah, on 99. Now, this is an area that's inaccessible to personnel. It's hard to see into with aircraft. They were working it with aircraft to try and keep it subdued and keep it from just getting up and going on us. But heavy fuel type, heavy smoke, you know, your options become limited at a certain point.
Okay, so these are dear friends of mine and colleagues and employees working public safety. So I think this was the 10th. So we're meeting together and they're taking us an assignment to go move people off of Hudson, Lake 4 and Hudson, working their way towards Insula. So where should I go with this? The fire is going to make its largest run the next day. Okay. More of the same. This young guy, most of you know, and I worked together about all 70 days on this assignment. The forest supervisor saw probably Tim and I on day 30 and said, "You guys are going home. You need a day off." So we took a day off and then we came back, and this was us probably chatting about what campsites we need to clear next. We ended up doing public sweeps of the area shortly after the large fire growth on the 12th from the helicopter. And we actually got Chip Elkins back. Many of you know him. And he had the grand idea of a megaphone, because I think he had always wanted a megaphone in his career with the Forest Service. And we finally gave him one in retirement, took the door off the helicopter, and he goes back and forth in front of the fire and tells people they have to leave. So we opened the toolbox this fire to some things that we'd never done before. We had to, and we learned a lot of things that we had to learn the hard way. And that is to move the public out more quickly than we originally thought. We use a little bit larger closure areas than we originally thought. We also learned the hard way that lakes are not a safety zone. We had some of our firefighters go in the lake to prevent themselves from being burned or too hot, let's say that. There was no direct flame impingement, but they were too close to a fire. So we learned that we no longer call a lake a real hard safety zone. There's certain things we can do with that, but the waves, when that large of a fire makes its own weather, the winds, what would you, 50, 60 mile an hour winds in drafts that pull into these large fires, and that will rock and roll the lake and flip your canoe. So, and this fire continued to go on and on. So actually the water temperatures cooled off at the end of this fire. Go ahead, Tom. Yes, this shows, I'm going to turn it back to Tom. This shows the progression. Each color, it's hard to see, but here's, like, for example, the 12th, the 11th and 12th.
Right, so you can see, you know, from the 31st through the 9th, this baby blue. And then, so we're like up in here. And we're in the box where we want to be. Everything's all good. And then on the 10th, humidity's just dropped just far enough where it got down to that critical level. Things that had a number of days of drying, and they continued to dry all the way through this process from when we first started our ignition, which was, I don't know, I forget exactly. Oh, well, it's up here. What is that then? Yeah.
It was before that.
Yeah, it was before that. I think it's the 5th. The 5th has got a date here. So that sounds about right. So it continued to dry all those days, and then it got to a critical dry point, and then we got wind, and then it just said, see ya. It just went it made a pretty good push on the 11th and then the 12th. This is all the 12th.
This is straight. If you, I mean, this is as straight as a fire perimeter gets. It's that wind driven. When you fly over this, it's a straight line across there of burned and green. And then it kind of turned
Right.
and went this direction. We could not get around this fire with aircraft at this point. Like the fire was, or the aircraft couldn't go high enough. I think it went to 30,000 feet and they couldn't fly around it any longer. So correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, we heard on the ground down here that it came out of Isabella and then it continued to do this. And then later that day, we were able to fly it again to see how far it had grown.
Yep, and that's why we got two different heads. It was burning one direction and shifted and burned another. And it made this interesting little shadow off the lake there. These are just big fingers for the fire. That's the last slide, actually. So I imagine there's a few questions. Go ahead.
Can you describe the event that stopped the fire for what change in weather? more
Ye-
specifically?
Yeah, when it got to, these points right here, it was, this rained. Actually, hailed an accumulating amount that evening of the 12th. And so it was raining and hail and humidity went up in the fire district. And then these little teeny bits of dark brown, those are just some smoldering areas that then grew a little bit further in subsequent days until we could get around them. But at that point in time, we had many aircraft from all across the country that had been prioritized. This was a national priority fire for a week or two.
But just to follow up, in terms of the rain, you get tenth of an inch of rain, quarter inch, sometimes an inch or two in a good storm. How much rain did it take to put that out?
Yeah, so he's asking how much rain did it take to stop this fire growth? I'd have to look that up. I don't think it was a huge amount. It was like less than a half inch.
Along with a little bit of rain, an increase in relative humidity, but more importantly for this one, it was the wind stopped. So as soon as this wind stopped, we had almost no spread.
And you can imagine, it doesn't take much rain for the twigs and the needles and stuff that are gonna be your initial carriers. Every time something's burning like this, it drops a lot of spots out ahead of it and all those grow into fires and they continue to go often ahead of the main front and become a new front. All those little spots stop having the ability to grow as well. Just a small amount of rain. There's another question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so when we were camped at Fall Lake Campground, Pillars there, so we were camped at Fall Lake on the 9th, 10th, and 11th. And so when we heard about the fire, we took a cruise up to the lookout tower up on the Fernberg. And you could see across to where the fire was blooming up and everything. You could see the smoke cloud. And then a couple of days later, I went out to the airport and I talked to some of the pilots. And a couple of them said they figured the smoke cloud was 56,000 feet high. Does that sound right, Carl?
Yeah, that's 50,000. I heard, 3,000 to 30,000 to 40,000 ish. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so then when several of us were taking pictures at the Garden Lake Bridge, when we saw it burn up a whole new batch.
Yeah.
The smoke plume would go up that column and only take 10 or 20 seconds to go up to the top of that column.
Yeah.
So in 10 or 20 seconds to 50,000 feet, you're going what, 200 miles an hour about in that column?
Right.
And so later on then, after it got done burning and everything, I did go up to Forest Center and stuff and in the roads up there, Comfort Lake and Section 29 Lake and that, and also walked the Powwow Trail. And the granite rock outcrops were crystallized on top. So they were like walking on cornflakes. The swamps were all dried out. There was no water left in the swamps up there. They were completely dry along the Powwow Trail. And
No, that was after it burned.
That was when it got done, yeah.
Yeah.
when It was done. So
Yes,
when I walked into the powwow, and
Yep.
I walked about an hour, 20 minutes, hour
Yep.
and a half north of the bridge across the river there,
Yeah,
didn't burn.
no, it's
But the
got a little
water
green
was
island around it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the water was so low that you could see the concrete and the steel pilings from the old truck bridge from
Yeah.
the old logging road back in the early days of logging for the center. So the water was probably, I'm gonna say, a foot and a half below the concrete
Yep.
piers that the pilings came from. Steel pilings.
It's a pretty amazing landscape down there, Isabella Country or the Powwow Trail. If some of you have hiked it before this fire, and some of you have probably hiked it afterwards. Now it's a carpet of mostly spruce. Like thick carpet. Yeah, good observation.
One more comment, but at one time, the PIO, Public Information
Yeah.
Officer of Donnie.
Yep.
Had all these photos online that you could go to. I
Yes.
tried finding them this morning, and I couldn't find
They're
them.
still there.
They
Yep,
are. huh?
yep.
Okay, I know I submitted a couple batches.
I think there was like on a Flickr account or something. I Googled it and found it, but if
Oh.
anybody wants to still see those, I can share with that address. Yep. Yes.
How does the Pagami fire compare with many of the other fires that we've seen in Boundary Waters?
Mhm.
And, like, that's one question I have.
Yep.
You can hang on to that. The
Yep.
other one is, when you closed the Boundary Waters last year, because of threats from the Canadian fires, I think it was because of threats from the Canadian. Were you just like constantly in contact with them to see what they were doing and progress on
Yeah.
those fires?
So then I take, were those your 2 points?
Take whichever,
Yeah.
whichever two questions.
Yeah, I'll start with the second question and back up to Tim.
Yeah.
So
So
we'll
the,
repeat the question quick, just so everybody. has
Yeah.
a-
so with the last summer's closures, were they affected they were affected by the Canadian fires. That was a large part of our concern. And yes, we were communicating with them every day, if not multiple times a day. That's one of Tom and his colleagues' jobs, is to communicate with the Canadians daily. And so those fires, and then remember, we did have some of our own fires. They were actually we kept them smaller, but we did have fires within the closure area also. So those were of concern. Because if those got wind, as we just learned, behind them, they would spread really quickly. So we were able to go after those fires in that manner. I hope that helps that part of the question.
And the second part, so the first part was, how are we communicating with the Canadians?
No, how does it stack up to the
Oh, yeah, thank you.
historic
Just trying to
fires,
remember
like
what-
Ham Cavity, of which,
Yep. So, they're, some of those fires are a little different, say, Ham was a spring fire, Cavity was midsummer, Pagami was fall. They all burn a little different fuel types with a slightly different nature. The Ham Lake fire was very fast and flashy, didn't burn anything deep. It just went right over the top, and that'll regenerate different trees than a fire that burns more slowly and really just burns more completely. So they have somewhat different effects, but largely, in terms of the severity of this fire, severity is a measure of how much fuel is reduced. This is a more severe fire, has a higher severity than, say, Ham Lake. Ham Lake took out a whole bunch of properties though. So, there's a lot of apples and oranges comparisons to the two, but this is the largest fire that Minnesota's had since the turn of the century, when the state was essentially covered in logging slash. And so we haven't had anything anywhere near this since, the early 1900s. This is a very severe fire in terms of how hot it burned and its size.
Tom, could you elaborate on the indices for Pagami versus this last summer? Because we were really dry this last summer.
Right, yeah, last summer was far drier. Our indices are what we measure the dryness of the fuels, the long-term drought measurements, our average temperature and humidities, and how much wind we get, all those things add in to just continue to add to the level of drought that we've got. What we had this summer was a lot drier than what we had during Pagami. It was dry during Pagami, but it wasn't alarmingly dry. It wasn't dry enough that we're like, boy, I don't know if this, should we keep doing this? It was a pretty clear plan. It was dry, but it wasn't out of the realm of something we would do here or in other states to contain a large fire that is not near any natural boundaries. We would typically do something like pull it with fire to natural boundaries to secure that thing. So what we did in Pagami wasn't alarmingly dry to take on that operation, though it continued to dry, and then we got the extreme wind, and that was really the factor that made Pagami what it was.
I have a fashion question. Everybody's wearing those nice yellow shirts. Is there a reason for that color? Is that a color that is more visible in heavy smoke? Or is it just a color that somebody picked out for every firefighter to wear?
I think it's a visibility thing, probably. Yeah. The question was, why do firefighters wear yellow shirts? And it's a good question. Those are Nomex. They're called Nomex shirts, and we have Nomex pants, which is a fire-resistant material. And all our firefighters have to wear that anytime they're on a fire environment. So yeah, yellow is probably just mostly so aircraft can see you and not drop 1,000 gallons of water on you or things like that.
I think, does that help, Becky?
Yes, thank you.
All right, good. Mr. Lampman.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One is, how large was the Quetico fire at number of acres that it actually burned? And second question, on Pagami Creek Fire, you know how long it takes where it burns really hot for the soil bacteria to replenish itself and allow things to grow again?
Can you remember how many acres were burning in Quetico?
So yeah, the question is how many acres burned up in Canada last summer in the Quetico just north of us. I don't have that exact acreage, but it was a lot more than burned here, including Greenwood.
We flew it and yes, go ahead.
114,000.
There we go. So Pagami was 100-ish, just under 100. So that's how much. Yeah, it was, and there was miles of the border on fire.
Was Quetico fighting it or just letting it run?
Yes and no. They also had other priorities farther interior of their country that they were focused on most of the time. But they did actively suppress some areas of their fires too.
Yeah, they were doing everything they could to keep it from coming across the border on us. And we were communicating with them daily. Nick Petrak is our zone fire management officer on the West Zone. He was flying it pretty much daily, or myself or one of his AFMOs or the assigned team that was up there at the time. We had a type 3 Minix. It's a Minnesota type 3 incident management team. We were also flying that as well. So they had many fires up in that Canada area just north of us, and several of them burned together into less but larger fires. And they were hitting them as much as they could, but they did have villages and towns that were burning down in other parts of Ontario. So when they have to prioritize things and where they're going to put a bunch of aircraft, it might be 250 miles north of the border in some very remote place, but it's a village that might completely incinerate versus something that's in their wilderness. So that's their priority, and that's it. To me, it stands to reason that they can only do so much when they have that many starts. There was dozens of them, smokes, just you could see them all across the horizon. It was uncontainable. Yes, sir.
There was a second question.
Yeah, the soils and bacteria question.
How long does it take soils and bacteria to recover, to regenerate after a fire?
I don't know the specific numbers. Does U of M back there know?
On April 12th, there will be an ecological response to the Pagami.
There you go.
Great question.
Okay,
Yeah.
April 12th Tuesday group, we'll have some answers for that. Talk about the ecological responses to the Pagami Creek Fire. Typically, it's within a week or two, we'll start to see some green growth coming back up, unless it's the most completely nuked off chunk of ground. But something will always come back up. Our biggest concern is that it's not an invasive species.
Yeah. Elton had his hand up a while ago.
So yeah, climate change is increasing drought and heavy rain. But anecdotally, not the only one who thinks it's windier than it used to be when you're out in a canoe. Is that documented, and how does that change your attitude towards wildfire?
Well, I'm not an incident meteorologist, but I did hear on NPR that this was the windiest. I think this was the windiest winter like ever, or one of the top couple. And I think that is reflective of, again, I'm not a scientist, but I have heard there is anecdotal evidence that as climate's warming, it's becoming windier on average. And I think that has to do with the slowing of the jet stream and some other stuff I can't explain further than that. But yeah, it is getting windier from my experience as a wildland firefighter, and that definitely impacts the ability to do things, because if the weather's less predictable, the wind's blowing harder, we can't put people in to go suppress fires directly. And then we have to start going indirect, which is what we call the big box. And those are big burnout operations, and they just have a lot more moving parts and they're harder to pull off.
Yes, over here.
Ron.
Supposedly the district ranger initiated, I can't remember what day, a substantial napalm drop. Did you talk about that? And after which the fire traveled, the next day about 16 miles toward Isabella.
You're talking on Pagami now, right? Okay. There wasn't, so we started ignition, I think it's from the slide on about the 5th, 4th, we had gotten some light rain. It might have even been earlier on the 5th. We had like a 10th, and then it dried a little bit that afternoon, and we tried to light because everybody was ready to go. We kept getting high humidity that we couldn't burn with, and then we got a little shot of rain, and we were waiting for it to dry. We started some ignitions. I think it was on the 9th, and they just weren't carrying at all. And we burnt, or no, the 5th that was, and then 5th, 6th, somewhere in there. We continued to ignite for a couple more shifts before we really had that largely that perimeter cleaned up. And I think there was a 4th day where they came back and did just a little bit more, just touching up on some pockets. There was no one particular day that they just dropped a whole bunch. The 2 days in the middle of the 4 days of burning was the brunt of it. But then there was a cleanup 4th day, and then it was on about the 5th or 6th day after they started ignition that the fire really started to get going. So it wasn't, I wouldn't say so much related to a lot of fuel being put on the ground in any one place at any one time. It was more that the fire just gradually became more established as a cohesive chunk of ground, you know, as it burned together, and it was cleaning up, but it's what we call getting its legs under it. You know, a fire doesn't just rampage, it's creeping, crawling, it stands up, it starts. And so it took a few days to get to that phase, and then eventually did with that wind.
So let me take a quick minute on this one. Let me elaborate on that a little bit, and then we're getting to the end of our time, and you're welcome to chat with Tom or I individually. I don't know what napalm was made out of, but this is a diesel mixture. It probably is similar. I'm actually going to have to go look at what napalm is, but it was written that way. And that's not what we call it. We call it drip fuel or some sort of diesel mixture, right? So there's that. It's called a helitorch. It actually was built or created, designed in Canada because it works better in our type of forest cover. But we also have the sphere dispensers. So those are ping pong balls. So this is not like willy-nilly throw fuel in the woods. We use drip torches. So this is the fine coloring in the edge of the picture on the ground. Then we use ping pong balls, or these spheres that fall out of a helicopter, and they have a delayed ignition. So those are kind of like using a fine pen to get closer to the edge. And then interior, we can use a helitorch. And that will generate heat interior that usually pulls the fire in to the middle of the column. As we described earlier, the column, you actually want that to build and grow because it sucks the fire in from the perimeter, whether the perimeter is a hand line, a dozer line, or a lakeshore. Okay, so just a little bit on that. And
but we had one person on Zoom ask a question, so I don't want to let that go. They toured the Isabella location while the fire was burning, and when there were hundreds camped there, and they were amazed at the resources needed to fight a fire.
can you share when the decisions are made to get new fire folks involved?
Yeah, so the question was, there was hundreds of firefighters here, right? And you guys have seen that when engines roll through town from all over the country. And Tom alluded to that, the mobilization of the National Fire Organization from all over the country. So yes, we got a bunch of them. Another point to add is it's not just a district ranger that makes the decision. So the district rangers manage the districts on the forest. That is elevated, these larger decisions to put more fire on the ground or to do a burn out of operation is made at a much higher level. So there's, you know, a lot of thought that goes into it in meetings with the Duluth office, with the regional office, and honestly, with the national office. So those decisions are made like that. And I just lost my train of thought. What was the question?
Well, about the hundreds of people.
Oh, yeah. So with those decisions made at those levels, we get more crews and resources and helicopters and aircraft. Okay, so if it was at the district level, we won't get those resources. When Washington or Milwaukee help us make those decisions, they send crews from Michigan, Montana, New Mexico, you name it. Okay. And when you may see those crews, you will see those crews show up in town at our restaurants and hotels. They will be in town before there's fire, quite honestly, most of the time. Because Tom and his crews on the fire end of our organization watch the indices and or have prescribed fires coming up. So they will order in extra resources.
No, I just, yeah, I think that you saw a lot of firefighters down by Isabella area as a reflection of the fire had demonstrated a need.
And it came out of wilderness there. It was the only place that came out of wilderness.
Yeah, it came out of the wilderness and at Isabella. So that was an area of real focus. You know, there's a community and we have to, we really hit that area hard as soon as it became threatened.
I know this is out of your sphere a little bit, but have the forest biologists noticed any difference in wildlife species in that area? Like have moose moved in, or is it obviously things happen, it's good for some species and not for others? Do you know how that's changed the
I know moose are doing better in every burn pocket we have on this forest. Ham Lake, Pagami, you're gonna see more moose down in the Greenwood area. We don't have these big fires for moose, but it's something that is, you know, I guess it's a positive that comes out of a negative event. And so, yeah, moose are definitely have benefited from these fires. They need them. And one of the big reasons we're losing moose, again, I'm not a biologist, but it's because they need vegetation to be burnt. So there's young growth. They don't eat balsam fir. They need, you know, regenerating young maples.
Well, a wonderful segue into continuing the conversation on April 12th. Sounds like Carl, you want to share something?
No, April 12th is another one, and I think you had the flyers going around, so make sure you check out the other programs scheduled this week.
Yep. Okay, well, thank you guys.
Thank you.